Welcome everyone to today's webinar hosted by CompetencyWorks. Today's webinar is about a recent event that we held on a paper that just was released on charting the course for the next phase of K through 12 competency-based education. And I'd like to start by introducing today's speakers, Nina Lopez, who is the head of Nina Lopez Consulting and a core leader in the work that we have done over the last year looking at the future of K through 12 competency-based education and the National Summit. Chris Sturgis, principal at Medicinet and co-founder of CompetencyWorks. And I am Susan Patrick, also co-founded with Chris CompetencyWorks, president of iNACOL. So thank you for joining us today. Please, we'll be taking questions throughout the webinar in the chat room. And those of you that are just joining, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat room and key up any questions. As we go through, we will pause and have time for questions and want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So thank you for joining us today. We'll get started. So the learning objectives for today's webinar are to really understand the purpose and design. We held a national summit on competency-based education in K through 12 this June 2017. We want you to become familiar with the 4 key issues that we addressed at the summit, which we feel are critical to advance and sustain competency-based education. But you think about the competency-based education field must address these issues to help lift them up, strengthen the field, and grow going forward. Number 3, we want you to dig in and consider recommendations for the field. And this is broad across many different organizations and educators and practitioners for how to advance competency-based education and learn about next steps and initiatives taking place. So as a quick background to help set the tone for the webinar, in 2010, CompetencyWorks, as Chris Sturgis and I discovered that the only literature in the field of K through 12 education and competency-based education was a report that was authored by the U.S. Department of Education in 2001. So when we set out to do a literature review, the first report that we published was called When Success is the Only Option, and we identified hundreds of innovators across the field of K through 12 competency-based education in pockets of innovation that were largely isolated. So when we held the first National Competency-Based Education Summit in 2011, that was in March of 2011, we brought together 100 innovators as well as policymakers in states to help develop the working definition of competency-based education and identify the top 10 tough issues that we needed to address as a field moving forward. In 2012, we launched a knowledge creation hub and online resource called CompetencyWorks, which is at competencyworks.org, to rapidly share knowledge, lessons learned, host a blog, collect resources, build a wiki, of the resources that are being developed by districts and schools to help share knowledge across the field and amplify the great work that's being done. And wow, have we seen the field grow. From 2013 to 2017, there's been increasing interest in competency-based education. And along with this, the different entry points and school leaders and educators at different points in their own journey towards competency-based education, we've identified some significant new challenges which we want to address. So the second National Summit on Competency-Based Education was held last June in 2017, and we're going to highlight some of the findings from that summit and as well as the resources that were created out of the summit and our findings on issues. So the purpose of the National Summit on K-12 Competency-Based Education was to work with the field, rolling our sleeves up to generate ideas and help provide guidance on 4 issues. Those issues are around competency-based education and a focus on equity and equity strategies, on quality frameworks for competency-based education, on meeting students where they are, and taking a long view on policy. In addition to these 4 issues, we worked with the field to survey emerging other tough issues that are challenging schools, educators, districts, and states that need to be addressed in the field going forward. And we will highlight both of these later in the webinar. So what was the process that we used? We really tried to have a participatory process. So we created technical advisory groups with experts in competency-based education from across the U.S. We call those tags. There were 104 people involved in these tags that ended up through week-long processes producing 4 draft issue papers. Those issue papers were required reading for coming to the summit. Then the 100 invited participants with a diversity of backgrounds, regional expertise, diversity in race, ethnicity, and perspectives, dug in and provided feedback on these papers and identified 14 new emerging issues. So the culminating report, which just came out, is called Quality and Equity by Design, Charting the Course for the Next Phase of Competency-Based Education. And it details the discussions and identifies recommendations. Is a very significant resource, chock full of information. So right now we're in the process of examining the working definition of competency-based education and developing a logic model for competency-based ed through new tags, new expert technical advisory groups, and we will be revising and re-releasing the 4 draft papers leading into the summit in the coming months on key issues, so be watching for that. So the papers that were originally released prior to the June summit will be re-released and rewritten with the input from the summit early in 2018. And that is a paper on quality, a paper on equity strategies, the paper on meeting students where they are, and a paper on long view on policy called Fit for Purpose. So with that, I would like to take this opportunity to turn it over to Chris Sturgis to talk more about the issues. And Chris, thank you for your incredible leadership in the field.
Yeah, back at you, Susan. Hi, everybody, it's Chris. So Susan's described the 4 big issues that we were tackling at the summit, and here's our beautiful picture with them all in one place. And the reason this is a great photograph or a great visual is that the more we dug into each one of these issues, the more we started to realize that they were actually like opening a door onto how to really improve the educational system so that every student would be successful. And so there's a lot of overlap, but when you're talking about meeting students where they are, you're often talking about what's going on in a classroom. When we're talking about equity, we're talking everything from structural to the classroom. Of course, policy is going to be at more structural on the policy level. So as you look through this, the report, I really encourage folks to try to think about how do these issues have implications across these 4 lenses. So what we're going to do today is dig in to some of the highlights of the ideas in each of these critical issues and some of the recommendations. So I'm first going to actually, hopefully you've opened up the paper of Quality and Equity by Design, and I just want to guide you through a few things in that paper. There's a section on page 7 where we start to really clarify what is the purpose of education, what do we really want for kids. And there's two things that we do in this paper, and this really came from the summit participants. So even though we're saying we as the authors, it reflects this enormous tag process and then 100 people at the summit. And people were very clear that our purpose of education is to help kids navigate life, college, and careers. It's not just college and careers. Some people want to say civic and life and college and careers, but life, getting a mortgage, figuring out your health insurance these days, and being able to participate in our democracy all require very high-level skills. And in order to do that, we really have come to the conclusion, and we all know this, everybody knows it, students have to have three sets of skills and knowledge. One is the academic knowledge. The knowledge is important. It's not just looking things up. You have to really understand and be familiar with the knowledge you're going to use. The skills to apply it, 21st century skills, there's a lot of different language around that, but the skills to apply the academic knowledge, and then the lifelong learning skills. And this might be described as student agency. It might be described as habits of success. It's actually a very big, complicated set of skills, and that's a major shift for the schools. Now, for people who are totally new to competency-based education, this is a pretty high-level webinar, but what I would do is encourage you to go to page 9 through 15 of the paper, and then we'll walk you through why the traditional system's inadequate, how it reproduces inequity, and what competency-based education is and how it's different. It's an important piece. And as you're looking through this section, also, it's important to understand that personalized learning and competency-based education go hand in hand. If we only had personalized learning without a competency-based system, inequity could certainly continue to flourish, and kids might be passed on still. Then at the end of the grade level, they're going to be passed on without the skills they need. Competency-based education without personalized learning is almost impossible. It is, if you're going to meet kids where they are, if you're going to build student agency, you've got to be able to organize in a more personalized way. So just keep thinking of it, going hand in hand. Okay, so now I'm going to my next slide, and we're going to look at quality. Now this is so important. We've been in a stage of a lot of innovation. Across the country, people really experimenting, exploring, trying to figure out what is the personalized competency-based system looks like. But now it's expanding so much, we actually have to pay attention to quality because a lot of people are implementing just a few practices, or they may only see it as a technical reform without understanding the cultural parts. And so what we've constructed, and this is a major, when you read the first quality paper, this is actually somewhat different. So I just want you to know that our thinking really developed through the summit process, and we will be re-releasing this. But as you'll see in this picture, culture is really important, and you can find it, the discussion on page 21 to 22. And the 5 areas of school culture that we think are absolutely critical for creating the conditions for competency-based ed, very clear focus on equity. We can't get to excellence unless we get to equity. We can't get to equity unless we think about excellence, and it's really important to be intentional about this. A culture of learning and inclusivity, and when we use the phrase inclusivity, we mean a culture that includes everyone, and the culture changes with the participation of people from different communities and parts of the world and different ways of thinking about things. The culture changes in dynamic. It is not inclusive in the sense of people being included and then having to meet the kind of mainstream culture. So it's really important to understand that. Making sure that there's relevance and meaning for kids, and that we also believe that an adaptive and empowering leadership is absolutely critical to competency-based education. And that, of course, we're going to be nurturing a growth mindset in students, but it's also in the adults, and we often forget that part. Many districts try to approach competency-based ed as a technical reform without this cultural shift. And we're seeing that right now in states that are trying to move to a statewide system, there's districts that didn't really want to make this change, feel that they have to because they have to comply with state policy. Well, compliance is pretty much the antithesis of empowering and adaptive leadership. So right off the bat, you can see how important this cultural change is. Now, when we talk about structure, we're talking about the policies, the processes, the practices that that districts and schools use on a daily way. And you can find this on page 23 and 24 of the paper. And parts of the structure that we think are absolutely critical are students advancing upon mastery. Of course, you know that's one of the main pieces. And it's not just about pacing everybody. It's really about making sure that there's enough supports and instructional supports to students to make sure that they're able to really learn everything that they're expected to learn. And of course, then once they learn, they should be able to move on, right? So that's an important step of this. Transparency is an absolutely critical component of the entire system, and something that we need to continue learning about. The system needs to be intentional and aligned to make sure that we're really having every student get what they need in order to be successful. Consistency and reliability. This is super important because in the traditional system, teachers all have their own grading systems. They all decide what proficiency looks like. They all decide what's good enough for kids to be able to get an A or a B. But there was no consistency about that, and that's actually contributed. It's not the teacher's fault. The system, the structure, actually created a problem of inequity and also actually contributed to low achievement overall, leading us to NCLB and that kind of top-down accountability. So when we start talking about consistency and reliability, we're talking about calibration to make sure that students and teachers have a really shared understanding of what proficiency looks like. Educators as learners, super important part of competency-based education. Everybody's a learner. And that there's an investment in structures to support continuous improvement and organizational learning. And when we talk about continuous improvement, we're talking about specific practices related to using data. Now, this is a big change for how we've talked about competency-based education in the past. We now have a section on the teaching and learning design principles, or pedagogy. And it's important to remember there is no one instructional model of competency-based education. We really believe that teachers need to use their professional judgment and based on where kids are, figure out what's going to be the best way to move forward. But there are a couple elements that we think do need to be consistently embedded in the pedagogy. And one, of course, that we're based on the learning sciences, and that includes engagement and motivation research. That student agency and ownership is cultivated. That there's rigorous higher level skills, that students have the chance for deeper learning or applied learning, however you think about it. And that it's responsive. We're constantly responding to the students, not to the needs of the adults or to some pace of the curriculum. It's important here to understand, and we've highlighted a couple of them in these beautiful purple icons on the left, that there's an overlap between equity and quality when we think about this, and we'll see it in a second. The culture of learning and inclusivity where kids really feel safe and belonging, that's so important to both quality and equity. The pedagogy based on the learning science is consistent to both. The intentionality, the alignment, the consistency, and reliability, they're all important. So some of the recommendations, which you can find both on page 49 and 52, is one, we really want to develop a shared understanding of quality design and implementation. Oops, let me do this right away, right now. We have little chat boxes in here for all of you to try to respond to. What information systems have you used to support monitoring student progress, and what are their strengths and weaknesses? This is a great opportunity just for you all to exchange ideas about something that's related to quality. So back to the recommendations. Developing a shared understanding is we really need to understand this culture, structure, and practices of the higher achieving districts and schools. And we want to explore quality assurance strategies that are used internationally to see if we can think of other ways that we might approach this in our country. We want to build up a base of research and evaluation, very important, and we want to get much more clearer on metrics, especially those that are related to pace and progress. And we also need to catalyze development of effective student-centered information management systems. It's very important for us to do this because the vendors are not moving very quickly for us. And we need to make sure that they understand how much demand there is. And what we are going to be doing, we've already right now in the process of updating the working definition of competency-based education, and in early 2018, We are also going to be working to develop a logic model because we think it's really important to keep clarifying our understanding of what competency-based education is. So those two things will be going on as well. Okay. Susan, are there any questions that I should address before I turn it to Nina?
Yeah, there's one really good question here from Sarah Berger. She's wondering about strategies to shift culture at different levels of systems.
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. And it's on my list, and I keep asking principals and schools that are going through the process how they make the shift. Rebecca Middles, I think, is on this call. And Rebecca, maybe you might be able to put in the chat room. Love this question, she says. If you read up on District 51 and CompetencyWorks, they invested the full first year on building knowledge about a growth mindset. And in doing that to help teachers learn about it for kids, they also prompted adults to think about it for themselves. And so right there, that starts to shift the idea from some kind of idea that intelligence is set in stone to something that is really growing and dynamic. But we are actually trying to figure out ourselves, how do you help folks understand what's different about competency-based education and to accelerate that understanding of the new culture and belief systems? So I don't have a great answer. I'm babbling. So I'm now going to turn it to Nina Lopez, who's going to walk us through both the ideas in the equity section and the meeting students where they are section. And I have to say, Nina has been just absolutely the best partner in the whole world doing this work. And you can find some blogs written by her as she visited Colorado schools. What we're going to do is we're going to have the questions answered at the end after she's done talking about both of these sections. Okay, Nina, turning it over to you. Remember to click the talk button.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Chris said, I'm super excited and thrilled to be on this and be part of this project. I'm going to try and introduce folks to some of the content that's in both the equity and meeting students where they are sections of the paper, and look forward for questions for those of you who've had a chance to look at those already. Needless to say, there's a ton of content in both of these, and you'll see that when you dive into the papers. The equity content itself in the paper that Susan introduced at the beginning starts on page 28 and would encourage folks to review that and refer to that. We spent, I think, a lot of time starting with the great ideas we got from the technical advisory group, shared and discussed those ideas at the national conference, and then spent a lot of time after that really trying to synthesize everything we heard, which is hard because there's a lot of great work out there and a lot of great ideas that we heard. What that led us to was to try and essentially create a framework, an equity framework, which has a set of 9 principles, which I'll walk through here shortly, some of which tie into what we just heard in quality as well as meeting students, and also have implications for the policy recommendations or the policy principles at the end. But first we needed to agree on what we meant by equity. And so we had really rich discussions about what that meant, what some of the implications were of some of the definitions, and landed ultimately on the definition that the National Equity Project uses. You'll see that here on the PowerPoint, and it's also laid out in more detail in the paper itself. But we found that that was helpful for a variety of reasons. One, we didn't want to add a new definition, but rather try and contribute to the field as it exists. We also thought that it was really important to try and build on this idea that shifts us from thinking about everyone getting the same to starting to really look at students and adults as individuals and creating a mindset and a framework and a vision that talks about folks' potentials and really being facilitators of fostering realization of potential. I do want to note when we use the term potential, we also spent a lot of time really unpacking that what we meant by that was not the idea that, for example, a teacher might say, this child is only capable of X, and having a sort of limiting effect on looking at individual potential, but instead really viewing each child and each adult as having a whole range of possibilities and potential for their growth, and more importantly, creating a sense of agency for them in realizing that. So I wanted to note that because we had lots of rich discussion about the idea of potential and sort of who gets to decide what that potential is. And for purposes of our paper, wanted to embrace a vision for equity that allows folks, views folks as drivers of their own potential and their own future, and create systems that make that possible. The 9 principles that are here on the PowerPoint of the equity principles, again, a lot of overlap here with the quality. That's not, I think, but unintentional. I think what we found, and of course the title of the paper, is in order to really have systems and school systems that are driving equity, it needs to be at the forefront. So the idea of equity actually needs to be embedded into the very core and design of the structure, as opposed to something that gets considered once a school's instructional design, teaching philosophy, and sort of physical structure, time structure, et cetera, that rather than have it be something that is layered on, that it needs to be thought of at the outset of the design of each of those systems. And so for that reason, I think you'll see a lot of overlap between the equity principles and what's in the quality section. Having said that, there are a few things that I really want to call out in among the equity principles, because they are, I don't want to say more powerful than others, but unique to the equity discussion and important for having a design that fosters equity and also is promoting quality. One of them is a great, I think, a segue from the great question that got asked earlier, which is the importance of focusing on adult mindsets and making sure that we're attending to the growth and the equity for the adults in a school as much as we are for students. Some of that is about ensuring that adults have the same experience of growing and learning that we're asking them to foster for their students. And some of it is also recognizing that this is a huge shift from what their own educational experience may have been, or what their experience as educators may have been in another environment, or perhaps even in the environment where they are if they're in a school that's making the shift to a true competency-based model. So that's one that we think is really important to be designing for from the beginning. Another thing that I want to point out is making sure that as we think about what it means to have a vision for success, and again, I think Susan introduced this at the outset, or Chris did, I apologize, that's not something that is presented or imposed upon a community, but that equity requires every actor in the system to have an active voice in co-creating what that vision is. So that does not mean that we envision a place where this school decides that students are we're only preparing students for sort of limited set of outcomes, but rather as we think about preparedness for all students to be ready to choose their future, whether that's college, career, both, but that vision includes the communities from which they come and the community that gets co-created in the school environment itself. And so we think that role in community is also a really important one. One other thing that I would love to point out among the equity principles, and then we'll turn to the recommendations on the next slide before we move on to the next section, is really also the importance of thinking about student progress, proficiency, and pace. So again, some of these are structural issues. We talked about those earlier, but they tie in really important ways with meeting students where they are. And doing that effectively requires us to be able to really understand and see students for who they are and what they bring. And that really requires some self-reflection and an ability to be inclusive and perhaps expand our own thinking around what students are bringing to their own educational experience. So it may be certainly that we're allowing students to move at a different pace through their academic continuum, but it also means that the methods that we're using to monitor that pace gives them, sort of recognizes what students are bringing to that process, which leads then to the last one I want to point out here, which is the role of student agency. And so feel really strongly that equity requires a shift in the role of students, and frankly that some of the shifts in competency-based ed, when done well, again, with equity as a goal and embedded into the design, is really sort of destabilizing in some regard some of the traditional roles and hierarchies we have between adults and young people, learners, and really starting to shift that so that we see everyone in our schools as learners, both adults and students, and that both have something to teach and all have something to learn. And that really requires us to create systems where students have agency within not only their own academic future, but also agency within the school itself. So we are not, I want to be clear, we're not necessarily advocating for a school whose model is necessarily what we might refer to as a democratic model. So it's less about the structure, and it's more just recognizing the role of students as agents in their own future and in their own education, and creating structures that allow that to come to the forefront. So I want to pause before I move on to the next one. I do want to pose, I think, a question for the chat box, and then I'm going to shift over to meeting students where they are. Oops, hold on a second. Let me advance to the next slide. Oh, thank you. I think someone else advanced for me. So recommendations really quickly, and you'll see as we're talking through these recommendations, we have a question for the chat box, which we'd love to pause on before we move to meeting students. The recommendations for improving equity, again, a couple of things we talked upon already. One is really important to be thinking about equity from the outset, and to be both building from what's already in the field. So you'll see several of our recommendations are focused upon how can we cull what's already happening out in the field, and then collect that and then redistribute that out so that those who are in schools already doing this work have a bigger toolbox from which to draw upon and to learn from each other and think about the kinds of strategies that may make the most sense in their particular environment, and also to continue to build that body of knowledge collectively as a community. The other thing I want to point out is we have several recommendations on the importance of leadership, and this is something that came up in the tag and really came to the forefront during our summit as well, which is the importance of leadership at all levels. So while we want to empower leadership across both students and educators, really important for those who are in also traditional roles of leadership to take responsibility for overcoming their own bias and really doing some self-examination and reflection in terms of what they're bringing to the conversation around equity, and then to continue to be champions for that and to continue to find champions within their organization and across their organization who are going to carry forward both the belief in equity but also the execution of the strategies that will make it possible to exist within schools. So I'm going to pause there and see. We'd love to see if folks have some questions for the chat box. Susan, I'm going to let you pause and see if there's questions.
Well, earlier, and it may have been just during the transition from the quality to equity, but I think these are important. So quality design, this is from Kathleen. Quality design and implementation needs to be grounded in learning sciences. It also has to have a common language to place it in practice by both teachers and learners. How can we better share our experiences in using the neurosciences to create personalized, competency-based systems that are inclusive? And I just want to emphasize inclusive. And there was a follow-up question, too, from Leonardo Moreno saying, how would I help students in an inclusion setting? So, Chris, I don't know if you want to address that, or Nina, you want to kick it off?
I'm happy to. So this is Chris. So around the neurosciences, so this, you'll see that we're starting to even write about on Competency-Works, kind of what the learning sciences can tell and inform us. But for teachers, that practice becomes the core of their work, which is the schools really need to have strong PLCs, time for teachers to talk among themselves and be pushing and learning each other about how because the learning sciences don't tell you exactly what to do, right? Because there's lots of different pieces of research and information. And so again, using your professional judgment, teachers have to really think about how they're organizing things. But here's the most basic. The learning sciences are very clear that students do best when we meet them more where they are in their zone of proximal development, and that students do not all learn at the same time, at the same place, moving through a curriculum. So the idea that we're covering standards or covering curriculums is the antithesis of what the learning sciences tell us. And so it's really about teachers and with their principals engaging in those conversations. On the issue of inclusion, I'll tell you, I've only been in 2 classrooms, and what teachers told me was that the basics of having a code of cooperation, the personalized classroom, the code of cooperation, having students being very clear about what they need to do and what proficiency means has really helped and has given great meaning to students, no matter where they are in their own progress of developing life skills or academic skills. And that there really wasn't a difference other than where kids were on their learner continuum, and more emphasis on some of the life skill behaviors. So Nina, I'm going back to you.
Great, thank you, Chris. Once again, the question sort of segues nicely to our next section, which is on meeting students where they are. 2 slides here really quickly just to introduce the folks on the webinar to the content here. I do want to make sure that in addition to having both participants in our technical advisory group and the summit, Redesign took the lead on this paper, and so we want to give them a huge amount of appreciation for providing both some starting ideas and then also organizing what we heard from the tag as we got ready for that summit. They are going to be taking what we heard at the summit, taking what's in the paper you have already, and we'll be re-releasing in January a new paper, a final paper just on this topic. So please look for that. So meeting students where they are, again, we started to talk a little about this already, I think, in the question that got asked in Chris's response. Want to make sure that we're clear about what we mean about this. So it doesn't mean that, again, that we have necessarily a track of students for whom success means something fundamentally different than a different track of students. But it really is, what are the tangible classroom level and school level strategies that allow educators to be able to meet students within their zone of proximal development and essentially create repeated experiences of academic learning and non-academic learning success for students. And that really requires teachers to be able to be rapidly and frequently and regularly assessing what students need, what they're ready for, and that students are partners in that. And that, needless to say, is not only challenging, but requires some intentional strategies and systems to be in place in order for teachers to both be able to do that and then be able to act on that information, with the goal being that students can really move along the continuum at the pace that they need to be able to be successful, recognizing that we've got sort of a shared vision of success for students at the end. When we looked at the strategies that are out there, and there are several, we really started to see them organizing themselves into 3 domains, and you'll see those on the slide in the PowerPoint here. One is really oriented around the importance of relationships, and so the ability to be able to meet students and sort of have this ongoing dance, for lack of a better term, in educating, providing educational experience for students really requires both the adults, the young adults, the young people in a school to be able to know and understand each other well enough to be able to continue to adapt the relationship they have in that learning process. And that requires really strong relationships and attending to it, and the time and space and the structures to be able to do that on an ongoing basis within a school. We then looked at a second sort of category of strategies, which were those concrete structures, be they assessment, be they changes to either instructional experiences that we were providing to students, but we needed to have a way for teachers to be able to really quickly pull down what they needed to be able to respond to what they were seeing with students in their growth. And then the third is instruction to advance learning, and this speaks to what we just talked about in terms of the learning sciences and making sure that we're really building on a rich body and growing body of knowledge about how students learn best. So within that, we found a couple of strategies that really helped us move to a system that's meeting students where they are, from a system currently that sort of has a pretty fixed set of strategies available for students, expects students to fit into those strategies, and oftentimes is based on either implicit or explicit fixed mindsets about students' ability to move through those. One is the idea of having modular learning experiences, so to be able to sort of pick and play at any given point, the suite of learning experiences that were going to work best for a student based on where they were at any given point in time. The next is the importance of assessment, and we talk a lot about assessment also in policy as well and also in quality. But important to have a strategy that allows us to be constantly sort of checking in and seeing whether the learning experience and what students are ready for, what they've mastered, and what they're ready to take on next. And that requires us to have assessment strategies, and we're using assessment certainly in its broadest sense, so not simply formal standardized assessments, but the ongoing process of gathering information about where students are in their learning trajectory, and doing that in a way that's oriented around mastery, as opposed to simply acquisition of skills. And that allows us really to equip teachers with the right set of next steps for students. Personalizing the path, I'm not going to talk too much about that. I think Chris talked about that in the beginning, but of course the intersection between personalized learning and being able to co-create with students the next set of learning experiences that are going to allow them to be successful, deepen their learning, and then move on to the next set of instructional tasks. Organized, timely, differentiated supports certainly has to do with both what we're offering to students as well as the time and space for them to be able to fully engage with the learning. So that means not simply reteaching, but certainly offering multiple ways to learn and engage with content, and being able to do that at a pace and in a format and a context where students are going to learn best based on their own learning, prior learning experiences, as well as their own learning styles and their interests and passions, which again speaks to the importance of relationships. And then lastly is the idea of flexible scheduling, which of course is the structure which allows these things to take place, and giving teachers the flexibility to be able to make adjustments for individual student interest, needs, and pacing. Let me move on to the next slide quickly, and then we'll take questions. So you'll see several recommendations here. I'm not going to talk through each one of those, but rather just talk at a macro level about some of the recommendations, how they relate to the strategies that I just went through. One is really, really important to think both about the inner culture, using learning sciences and bringing them to bear for students, and the intersection of the two of them. So there certainly is a relationship between them. Each of them I think we know a ton about and are learning more. Culture really needs to be at the forefront in the outset as we think about creating a school that is oriented towards meeting students where they are, as opposed to asking students to fit into a school structure. Monitoring, communicating student growth. I talked a little bit about this already. I do just want to emphasize here that having an assessment strategy and a suite of tools to be able to sort of make adjustments based on what we're learning is important. Equally important to engage students and families in an ongoing way with transparency about what we're seeing and what we're learning from those assessments, so that they can be active participants and owners of that learning, and also informing what those next steps are. You'll see also the next set of recommendations, which speaks to building the capacity within districts to respond to a wider set of performance levels. And again, I think this one speaks to, if we have a broader set of assessments, if we're trying to create a bigger toolbox for educators to use to be able to deploy a variety of approaches to students based on where they are and what they're ready for next, just recognizing the importance of the broader systemic structures that oftentimes may run counter to that. So when we have fixed grade levels, we have perhaps fixed notions at a district level about graduation requirements, and how students move through that system towards those graduation expectations. Doing this well and allowing teachers and students to do it well really ideally requires them to exist within a broader educational context, typically the district context, that anticipates students moving through at different paces through different experiences. And so some work at a more systemic level is really critical to be able to have schools be successful in implementing some of these strategies. And then once again, the importance of adult mindsets and importance of attending to our educators and providing them with both tool strategies, but also a network of peers to be able to learn from and with, exchange ideas, and really have a community of practice that's learning and growing along with students. So I want to just pause here. We have another, certainly take any questions on what we just covered. We do have a question we'd love to put out to the group, a chat box question, which you'll see in the PowerPoint, which is we'd love to hear from those who are on this webinar. In what ways and what strategies are you using to meet students where they are? So I'm going to pause. I'm going to turn off my talk and let Susan pull out questions that may have emerged as well as responses to that one.
Thank you, Nina. And there's excellent dialogue going on in the chat room. There really aren't too many questions. There's one from Kathleen, and if you have other questions, please type in your questions now. We'll just do this one and know that as other questions come up, we're going to have time to address them at the end, too. So Chris and Nina, Kathleen says, in order to meet learners where they are so they can, in the end, take ownership of their learning, do we not need to empower learners to understand how they learn first? Chris, did you want to take that?
Hi, Kathleen. Yes, of course we do. So this is one of the things that's the understanding of student agency, ownership, the maturity that kids need to be able to take their ownership is something that we're all going to be learning about. It's a combination of creating a learning environment in which students have opportunities to take some responsibility for their learning. It requires gradual release, right, and coaching as students build up those skills. And then there's a whole set of skills and dispositions that right now are being kind of discussed in separate buckets. And I think over time we'll probably merge a little bit, but it's the growth mindset, it's social emotional learning, it's metacognitive skills, self-regulation or executive functioning is clearly very, very important to this. And it's actually the habits of success, right? Just having just the really basic kind of habits that you need to be a good student. So schools are starting to develop all those sets of capacities to coach and teach kids and to really engage in reflection with students. So they become very cognizant of their own learning processes. And it's one of the bigger differences we see in the schools for sure. Thank you. So Susan, let's turn to policy. Take it away.
Great, thank you. So issue number 4, and I'll get us on track here, is looking at policy. And specifically during the National Summit, what we're wrestling with is so much of K-12 education policy is tweaking the existing one-size-fits-all system. Oh, we collect data all about the current system. Oh, when we're talking about powerful ideas, about the transformative change that is needed to move to a whole different system, a competency-based learning system, then we've got to put this out there. We've got to put out the idea that we need to think about a long view on policy and what are really deep issues or threshold concepts. So the idea of threshold concepts are core concepts that once understood are needed to transform a given subject. And we have identified for the long term 4 threshold concepts related to moving to competency-based education. And one is, we know that our diplomas right now list Carnegie units with varying amounts of learning. So the whole concept around really certifying learning that's been demonstrated with mastery is a major issue to tackle. It also involves, you've heard us talk about these more holistic definitions of what student success looks like or profile of a graduate. So looking at certifying learning meaningful qualifications, qualifications that actually demonstrate what you know, what a learner can know and do. Number 2 is assessment literacy. I was at an event last year at the White House on assessment literacy. Less than 1% of our colleges of education, educator and leader preparation programs cover assessment literacy. And we're talking about understanding assessments for learning. That is the development of appropriate assessments for the proper function and purpose, aligned to learning, as well as understanding all of the different elements of consistency, professional judgment, how you develop moderation practices is just a huge gap in the United States, in the American education system. You will see this very well developed in international models and global education systems, and we've got to get our head wrapped around what that looks like to build capacity for assessment literacy. Number 3 are pedagogical innovations based on learning sciences related to competency-based education structures, cultures, and models. And number 4, again, is an intersection here with meeting students where they are. And you heard Nina talk so eloquently about this issue holistically, of meeting kids where they are, recognizing students' backgrounds, where they're coming in, there's one proximal development. Our current system is not doing this very well, and we've got to think about what that change looks like for the long term. So in the paper around policy, not only did we identify these threshold concepts, but we're building out recommendations. So absolutely critical for states and local communities to begin to build out a vision and strategy for the long term. And you see some states really working on trying to figure out a theory of action. What does this look like in the long term? How do we get started? What are the first steps we can do? But we've got to get a long-term plan for more transformative policies. Number 2 is really looking at how do we build professional learners. So leaders, educator workforce, systems, building capacity. This needs modernizing. And so there's a whole section on this. Building assessment literacy, and then alignment of higher education, and this is in a multitude of ways, to K-12 competency-based education models. Like, how do we truly get to system coherence and alignment? And I'll just do a little spoiler alert. We are working on revising this paper called Fit for Purpose, focused on the long view on policy and systems change. We will have a follow-up paper also that will include action steps tied to these recommendations for policymakers. So on one hand, we're talking about these powerful ideas and putting them out there in this paper and in the summit final report. And on the other hand, we're going to follow up and continue to do more work on specific action steps, including redefining student success, as Chris mentioned earlier, for academic knowledge, skills, lifelong learning, social emotional capacities, empathy, and life success towards college career readiness. So that is the big picture on the 4th issue of policy, and in the chat box we'd love to hear from you on what is your experience in developing a new definition of student success. Have you done the profile of a graduate work? What are the implications for design and pedagogy? Thank you.
Hey, Susan, I think that I didn't see any specific questions that weren't answered in the chat box. So why don't you move on to the emerging issues?
Great, thank you. So the emerging issues, this was the other big part of the summit, which is to identify other tough issues beyond these 4 that we've just focused on. And I'm not going to read all of these in the slide, but this gives you a scan of not only the work that CompetencyWorks is focused on, but collaboratively we're working across dozens of organizations across, and other nonprofits across K-12 education, which are working on issues with competency-based learning. So here are some keys. How can technology best support competency-based education? How can we scale personalized competency-based education? How do we build better communications, public understanding, and public will to support this move? How do districts and schools prepare for proficiency-based diplomas? How do we focus more on building agency and lifelong learning skills? What are the implications for human capital? And I'll highlight this last one. What does teacher preparation and training look like in a personalized competency-based system? That is all learners, adults and students, having competency-based learning models where they demonstrate their learning, and that gets certified in new and different ways. So Chris, did you want to add anything else to these emerging issues?
No, but we do have a question here from Sarah. Any thoughts about how to help schools and school systems who have made missteps or those who think they're doing CBE when they aren't? I actually will tackle that. We at CompetencyWorks have made a commitment, and we've already started it, to start talking about the missteps. But here's where it gets tricky. We depend on schools to open up their doors and talk candidly with us. But that means we can't come out and write a article about them that says, yeah, they had all these 5 missteps, and boy, that what they were doing was really emerging and wasn't very well developed. They won't let us in, and it does not help them do their work. And we're committed to making sure that we're helping schools do their work. So what we're doing is when we see missteps, we're collecting them and trying to analyze what may have caused the misstep, and then we'll write a blog article about them. You'll see it under red flags. We call them missteps and red flags. A red flag being, looks like there's a problem, maybe not based on their model, but it's important to think about it. So we are trying to do that. We really encourage a shift in leadership in the field right now, which is to take the time and be critical friends for each other and tell people when you're talking with them if an idea isn't well developed or if it's a misstep, because otherwise they really might not know, and that's not their fault. We just need to help people understand when that's happening. Okay, yep, so it's my slide on next steps. Okay, so here's some of the things that we just went through recommendations, and the recommendations are really for the field at large. They're not just for what we were doing at CompetencyWorks or at iNicole. It was really based on trying to help the field, based on all these people involved in this process, to think about what needs to happen to move us forward. But at CompetencyWorks, we are doing a couple specific things. We're going to continue to amplify the work and sharing knowledge across the fields the way we have, including webinars, blogs, resources. And if you haven't been to the wiki, you should check it out. It's always in process. It's always messy. And we're always looking for help to fill up those sections. But we are, as I just said, going to be focusing on missteps and red flags, as well as the case studies. We're revising each of these 4 issue papers. We're updating the working definition and developing a logic model. So by we think March, I think now we're sliding to April, we will be releasing a paper with a final kind of updated working definition and a much deeper understanding of what competency-based education is. And hopefully that will help with this issue around quality. In summer, fall, we're going to have another technical advisory group on professional learning that we really want to make sure we're capturing the knowledge and approaches being used by schools and districts. And then, in case you don't know about it, but the iNicole Symposium is really the best place to come meet other competency-based innovators and advocates. And it'll be in Nashville on October 21st to the 24th this year. And there's a full strand of competency-based sessions. And on the first day, we always try to have one district share their approach for newbies who are just trying to get their head wrapped around how do you do this work. Thanks to Rebecca Middles and the District 51 gang, they were there this year. And so that's a great place for folks who are just trying to get started to go. So I think that's it. The last thing I'll just say, and I think we have all our emails here, you can contact any of us, but we are always looking for contributing authors to write about their experience. And this question about how to make the cultural shift and how to help other people make the cultural shift, that's one of our leading questions that we're always looking for people to write about. Any kind of lessons learned, anything on missteps, totally the most valuable thing you can do for the field is to write about that and share it. And we make it really easy for you to publish. We'll help you write it. So thank you all. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Nina. Susan, you want to say any last words?
No, thank you for your leadership, Nina. Thank you for all of your great work and contributions and authorship in this final report. And please, to all of you that joined us today, thank you for sharing your time, your energy, and your ideas. We will continue to build on these discussions and tough issues, and we would love to hear from you. And if you have other issues that you're grappling with as you implement competency-based education, please feel free to share those with us, and we'll try to work across the field to share knowledge and emerging practices. So thank you so much for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.